Hello and welcome to the opening lecture in this year's Orkney International Science Festival online. Indeed, it's a keynote lecture on what might well be the most important issue in the world today, climate change. And we're going to hear about an aspect of it where we could all make a difference. This is in regard to soil health, which is a subject about which our speaker, Professor Karen Johnson, feels passionately. Karen's background is in natural science, and she worked in the water industry before moving to Durham University to teach environmental engineering. She's worked with the UK government, helping to launch the UK's soil health inquiry back in 2016, and she's now starting to work with the United Nations on the agenda for rebuilding soils. And how that rebuilding can be done, and the urgent need for it, is what she's going to tell us now. Karen, good morning and welcome, and it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Howie. And can I say it's such an honour to be invited to the Orkney Science Festival. I would love to have been up there with you and undertake the wildlife walks. I'm really excited about some of the talks, the Wealth of Weeds talk in particular. I'll share my screen now and start my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about a nation that rebuilds its soils. You're probably more familiar with the famous truism, a nation that destroys its soils, destroys itself. And of course, it was Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s who said this, and he said it because a lot of soil was lost in the Dust Bowl of the Midwest of the US. It was blown away. We hadn't looked after the soil health. We hadn't valued soil and treated it as the living ecosystem that it is. And it's through our use of conventional intensive agriculture that we've caused soil degradation all around the world. So a third of all of our cultivated land is degraded. And either by wind erosion or water erosion, the soil is not staying where it's meant to stay because we've damaged the soil structure. And this is because, as I said, we haven't treated soil as living, and soil is living. It's not a matter of there is life in the soil. There is life in the soil. And I know some of you will recognize this creature as a tardigrade. My kids absolutely love it. This is one of the bigger creatures in soil. There's bacteria, there's fungi, there's nematodes, there's a whole web of food in there and living organisms. And they're actually the organisms that are constructing the soil. Without them, there is no soil. There's a pile of minerals and a little bit of organic matter. It's not structured in the form that we know it. We can measure how healthy a soil is. We term this soil health, and it doesn't have any strong measurement methods, I'm afraid. We can measure it using underpants, and this has been quite popular in raising awareness of soil health around the world. So you can see here, people have used cotton, and they have to be cotton, not polyester, underpants, and put them in the soil. And you can see over a period of time, the more degraded they are, that means there's more microbial activity in the soil, which has eaten the cotton, broken it down. And so your undies are soiled, is what people say. So we can measure it using this, not a very robust, not very technical term. We understand a lot about the soil, but it's so complex. There's so many microorganisms in there that we're never going to understand it fully. What we do know is that we have been killing it, and soil is now scraping a living in many parts of the world because we're actively killing it. So this picture tells many stories. You can see that these guys are spraying the fields. It's a monoculture, which is not a natural soil ecosystem. And it's being sprayed probably with herbicides and pesticides, over-sprayed, which is killing some of the life in the soil, and the lack of diversity in the plants means that we haven't got a natural ecosystem. This sort of intensive conventional agriculture is not good for the soil. On top of this degradation that we've caused through intensive agriculture and the use of chemicals, not just herbicides and pesticides, but chemical nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, which break the symbiotic relationship between the soil microbiome and the plants. On top of this soil degradation, and don't worry, the whole talk isn't all doom and gloom. On top of this, we've got a vicious cycle of soil erosion and climate change. So we saw the evidence for soil erosion because we've been killing the life in the soil. Soil erosion leads to more food insecurity. So it tends to be in conventional intensive agriculture that we use more fossil fuel derived chemical fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides in order to get the same yields. So this leads through carbon emissions and nitrous oxide emissions to more climate change and extreme weather events like flooding, drought, and of course the fires that we've been seeing. So this vicious cycle is something that we have to stop. And that's what the work myself and colleagues at Durham and across the world are working in order to transition us from conventional intensive agriculture to more regenerative agricultural practices, which won't damage the soil and make it vulnerable to these climate change intense weather events. This image, I want you to focus in on the middle ball here. It's encapsulated as 3 balls in a sort of Newton's cradle formation in order to emphasize that this healthy soil in the middle is where we should be, but we're swinging from one extreme to the other of flooded soils and water-starved soils where we've got droughts and we're subject to fires. So you can see the 3 colors here in this ball, which is, if you see it like a pie chart. In the healthy soil, and this is a mineral soil, rather than the peaty soils that we have in the temperate regions of the global north, we've got 50% of the volume of the soil is made up of minerals. So things like sand and iron oxides and clays and silts. And then the other part of the soil is air and water, but a very small part and a very important part is soil organic matter. It's a little bit small in this slide, but it says SOM. That stands for soil organic matter. And of course, that is taken from the atmosphere by the plants in photosynthesis and pumped into the soil. Part of it is fed to the microbiome in exchange for nutrients, which the microbiome, which means all the bacteria and fungi in the soil, extract from the minerals. So it's a synergistic ecosystem. In the drought situation, we have more air than water, and this leads to the soil organic matter being lost as carbon dioxide. And also, of course, in just like we saw in the previous pictures and in the Midwest in the 1930s in the US, we see that the soil is literally blown away. So it's not just the soil organic matter that is turned into thin air or into global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the actual mineral particles, the finer ones, that are blown away. And those are very important for healthy soils, not just the organic matter, but the minerals. On the other side, we can see that when we have these intense rainfall events and we've got flooding, then we're losing the minerals to the hydrosphere, to our rivers and lakes and to the sea eventually, and they are washed away. And then of course we're losing the soil organic matter as well as greenhouse gases, but it tends to be methane and nitrous oxide, which are more damaging as greenhouse gases, more damaging than carbon dioxide. So now I want to take a step back and look at what soil should be if there weren't any humans on the planet. And of course, I'm a realist. We're going to move to a situation where we're looking at what we want soil to deliver for us as well as the natural environment. But if we think about soil circular economy and start with that pie chart again of 50% minerals and 1 to 10% soil organic matter and the rest divvied up between air and water. This is a healthy soil. Then if we turn it into a flower and look at the definition of an economy is something where we are taking resources and managing them. And in a natural economy or a natural ecosystem, then we're taking those resources, producing a product or a service, consuming it, and the waste is returned as a new input of a sustainable raw resource. In our linear industrial economy, we're not circular at all. We're taking resources, we take all of our metals and organic matter, fossil fuels from the earth. We use them either as a product, an iPhone, we make iPhones, etc., or as a service, like the services we get from our NHS. We consume those products and services, and then, as we know, with obsoleteness being built into our industrial economy, we throw those things away. We are moving governments around the world towards a circular economy to reuse waste as resources. Let's focus back in on what soil's natural circular economy looks like. Well, those resources that make soil come from the atmosphere. The carbon and nitrogen and the oxygen are taken from the atmosphere by plants in soil, plants and microbes. The hydrosphere, we get our hydrogen from there and also oxygen. And the geosphere, where the minerals come from. And all of these things are necessary to build soil. And it is in fact life, as I said, it's the living aspects of the soil that take those components and construct them into a healthy soil structure so that the soil can provide services for the environment. So the resources are taken and converted into the product, which is soil, our terrestrial biosphere. And globally, that provides a service. And the service is cycling all of these nutrients, micro and macronutrients. So the macronutrients, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium are all cycled through the terrestrial biosphere. But so are the micronutrients like manganese and iron and zinc. It's also providing a space for those living organisms in the soil to attach to. And locally, of course, it's growing the product of plants that we or other animals eat. Either a vegetarian or you eat vegetarians, we're all dependent on the soil for producing that food. And also other ecosystem services, we call them, things like carbon storage, which improves the soil health, and also water storage. So the consumption is by plants. Plants will extract micronutrients that the microbiome has sourced for them from minerals, and they'll extract those micronutrients into their leaves. And then, of course, when an animal comes along and eats that plant, then that is taken and consumed from the soil. The other consumption that goes on that's quite important is here attached to this SOM wedge, the soil organic matter wedge, is that we have less accessible carbon and nitrogen stocks, which is when we talk about sequestering carbon and building it up in our soils to meet Paris climate change agreements. This tends to be attached to the mineral surfaces, hence it coloured in brown. And in green, it's a bit faint here, but this is in green on the right-hand side of this wedge. These are the more accessible carbon and nitrogen stocks. And these are literally like sugar to the microbiome. It's an energy source for them, and it's their bread and butter. So there's several types of consumption going on here. Of course, the waste that is produced in a natural circular economy for soil is returned as a resource, because the plant litter and the animal feces, which contain the macro and the micronutrients, are naturally returned to the soil. What we've done in our cultivated systems is we've taken off the plants, we take out more organic matter and, of course, the micronutrients that have come from the minerals, then we put in. We return nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Sometimes micronutrients we return, but very rarely. Usually return NPK in the form of chemical fertilizer, which, as I've said already, damages that synergistic relationship between the plants and the microbiome and weakens the resilience of the soil. But the important take-home message from this slide is that in a natural system, these things are returned. Whereas, of course, in our globalized economy, we move these resources, these products of food and textiles around the world. We're also producing bioenergy crops, which are not returning the same level of macro and micronutrients to the soil. So, soil is not very glamorous, but it does underpin all life. And we believe that countering Roosevelt's quote, "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. A nation that rebuilds its soil rebuilds itself." What we're looking to do is really not rocket science. It's putting the carbon and the minerals back in the soil at the same time, because these are the raw resources, the inputs that the soil microbiome needs in order to build up ecosystem services, to hold on to carbon and to hold on to water, and also to provide the right level of micronutrients into the plants and therefore into us. So it links directly into human health. So we need changes in policy in order to make this happen, because often the source of minerals is from waste materials, as we saw in that circular economy diagram. But these are often industrial wastes. And of course, we have to make sure that they're clean and safe, but we've become far too risk averse. We need to look at the benefits of adding these minerals back into soil with organic matter that we haven't been returning in sufficient quantities. If we get those policy changes that enable this improved circular economy for soil, then we can optimize macro and micronutrient content of the soil. Now that's important for the food that we eat, but ultimately we're feeding the soil microbiome. If it's got the right materials, then it will have the right relationship with the plants and produce healthier, more nutritious plants, which are going to be better for us. If we've got the policy changes as well, we make farming a more attractive and economically sustainable proposition for future generations. So this will enable a transition to more regenerative agriculture. That just means agriculture which is using fewer chemical fertilizers, fewer herbicides and pesticides. Ultimately, we hope that we would need to use very little, but this is going to take 5, 10, maybe in some cases more time in order to achieve. And of course, our economic system is not set up for those timeframes in farming. But eventually, when we've got diverse vegetation and plentiful SOM in our soils, plus the right minerals, we're going to have improved yields of nutritious food, which is improving human health. That's going to mean better ecosystem service provision. And that's where the climate change connection comes back in. Because if we build up that soil health, we're also building up soil organic carbon stocks. And the figures are very debatable, but improving soil health can certainly make a significant contribution to climate change mitigation, not least by moving away from intensive agriculture where we use fossil fuel derived chemical fertilizers, which release a lot of nitrous oxide when we use those fertilizers on the soil. So improved carbon stocks also leads to improved soil structure, which is going to deliver the other ecosystem services that are so important to us at the moment with climate change. Those ones that help us adapt to climate change, like flood and drought resilience. And also farming is going to be seen as more socially and financially rewarding if we start to reward farmers for providing those services and actually looking after the soil and not degrading it, as well as producing food. All of our intensive agriculture has been set up and done a very successful job in terms of feeding millions of people around the world, but it's also had the disadvantage of killing the soil, and we are reaping the consequences now, which is why it's quite urgent to start this transition, because it will take time to regenerative practices. So the problem is getting people to change, getting us all to change. We're all aware with COVID and with climate change that there's an urgent need to change our system of our lifestyles and our diets and move to more sustainable agriculture. But we need a method of engaging society with farming, and it's starting to happen. There's a real momentum, and I really want to engage you in that process. What we believe we can offer is ideas about education around the idea that soil is living. Everybody has known for many decades that there's life in soil, but that soil is living is quite new, really, to science. So we believe that a nation that rebuilds its soil rebuilds itself. Now, if we think about the earth and this beautiful image, taken in 1969, where we saw how fragile the biosphere was and how thin the atmosphere was and how thin the soil was, then we realize that it's a materially closed system, i.e. we've only got one planet and this is where we get all our resources from, but it is energetically open. It gets its energy from the sun. And of course, fossil fuels are just condensed solar energy. What we want to do is engage people using that biosphere concept and that materially closed, energetically open system. So we're looking at societal engagement a bit like the underpants, not rocket science, with jam jars. So here's a picture of a jam jar. Here's one my kids prepared earlier. It's otherwise known as a terrarium, and you can see it here. You can see a little Lego figure. The kids absolutely love this. There's a bit of soil in the bottom, as you can see on the diagram, maybe a bit of gravel to make sure it doesn't go moldy. And then you can put whatever plants you want in. This has been going for some time. And you can put whatever figures you in. So for kids, you can put Lego figures in, you could put sticks in, and importantly for kids, they can get their hands dirty. And for farmers and for policymakers and for scientists, we can use this system in order to study soil and particularly the cycling of carbon and water and nutrients in this system. So we're starting to do that. It wasn't our idea. This is a paper published in 2011 by Milku in Nature Climate Change in 2011, and it's been cited 30 times. It's a tragedy. It's such an exciting concept. And of course, we have had Biosphere 2 in the middle of Arizona, where we tried to have people living in a sealed system, a bit like the sort of looking like the Eden Project, and it didn't work. There's a lot we don't understand, but we can start to study it with these physical models as well as computational models. So back to the Earth and sustainability. The Earth, of course, is very small. This is the image of the pale blue dot. If we think about sustainability and think about, again, the definition of an economy is basically how we manage resources. So the word economy in terms of finances is we get all of our money and profit from the land, from the resources that we take out of the land and turn into products. But basically, a sustainable economy must operate within the limits of society. Of course, there is more than one type of economy, even though we're all morphing towards the capitalist system that we have in the West. And that, in order to flourish, we now know with climate change, has to be within the limits of nature, because otherwise nature comes back to bite us and harms us financially and societally. Now, the link between sustainability and soil health is best encapsulated, I would say, through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we've talked about climate. SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal 13, is right up there linking with soil health for the reasons that we've discussed. Biodiversity, we haven't discussed explicitly, but the more biodiversity you've got underground, the more you have above ground. And we know about the importance of biodiversity for our health and also for the environment. Resources and wastes, this is the circular economy, SDG 12. Energy links to the soil. Often soil and energy are vying for the same carbon-rich wastes. And we have to take this into account if we want to rebuild our soils, because we need those carbon-rich wastes to be returned to the soil. Our health, of course, very much on our minds in the last 16 months, SDG 3, and clean water, SDG 6. And zero hunger. They all link to soil. Culture, we have to look at culture. We have to look at the cultures that do value their soils. For example, some of the indigenous communities in New Zealand and Canada. Excuse me. We can't talk about soil without talking about economics and decent work and no poverty. Soil is the foundation of our health and wealth, and a lot of jobs need to be made around a green future, including more sustainable agricultural practices and products coming from the soil. Education I talk about in my final slide because it's so important. And of course, data sharing. So these are the UN 17 SDGs. And the final point I want to make is that you'll note that they're dotted around these 3 nested circles, which you could kind of see as the disciplines. So I know this is the Science Festival, but I'm so excited about the Science Festival. It's quite clearly very interdisciplinary. There's an awful lot of art, and I see that there's economics in there. It's not just science. Science doesn't work on its own. We need all of the disciplines in order to address the world's global challenges. So now I'm just going to spend a few minutes telling you about what we've achieved so far, which is very little in terms of rebuilding soils. We're just at the start of this process, and that's why I was very honored to be asked to present here today to you guys, and would love to stay in touch with you and hear your ideas about rebuilding soils. Locally in County Durham, where I'm based, we have rebuilt a soil which was degraded and attracting a lot of negative attention. It was a wasteland with some contamination. And we've transformed it into a hub of community activity. So it's now still just a green space, but not a wasteland green space. And it's used every year on November the 11th to celebrate this guy, Dennis Danini, who lost his life in World War II. And many people get together, and there's a bench there that people look out. This is a site called Easington Colliery, which was a former mining village, and there's no mining jobs there now, and it suffers from a lot of social deprivation and economic deprivation. So it's a very small part of regeneration there, but it's really helped that community with reclaiming that land. The wastes that we used as resources there, this is actually a picture of a water treatment works in Ghana, but the waste on the left-hand side is a clean drinking water waste, so it's not contaminated with any pathogens. It's important to note that any waste you dig into the soil, you have to check to see that they're safe and clean and going to improve soil health. It's mainly iron oxides, and that's a really great thing to be digging into your soil, especially in conjunction with compost. And the little pictures that I'm putting up now are transmission electron micrographs. You can just see, if you get your eye in the scale, 50 nanometers, on these rectangular shapes you can see on the left-hand side in figure A are clay platelets. And then the black sort of odd robot-shaped bits are iron oxides and manganese oxides, which stick very nicely to clay particles. On the right-hand side, what you see here are humic materials. So this is organic matter, and iron oxides stick very nicely to organic matter as well. So this is part of the reason that the co-amendments of minerals and carbon work together, is these are the resources that the soil microbiome needs to make soil and stick that soil architecture together. So nationally, we haven't done anything, but we've got some news. The good news is that since the soil health inquiry, soil health is risen up the political agenda. It's now in lots of documents. I've got an example here, the industrial strategy. At the minute, it seems to be words, but we are moving in the right direction. We're making progress, trying to work with the government to set out guidelines for how soil can be part of local authority net zero plans. But it's not all good news. There's an awful lot to do, and we desperately need these policies. And we've only just started this process of campaigning, as it were, and writing academic papers that we work with policymakers on this area. We need the policies in place that enable us to add waste minerals back into the soil when they're clean and safe, where they belong. So it used to be the norm. I was speaking to a farmer just the other day whose father had dug sand, 3 centimeters of sand into his clay soil. To this date, it's the best field he's got, but he's not allowed to do that anymore. Policy gets in the way. Some countries have achieved this. Brazil has legislation in place which allows farmers to do that, to use minerals to improve soil health. just a couple of slides on some technical results so you can see some of the science that we've done. This is a paper that we produced in collaboration with partners at Stellenbosch University and also University of Zimbabwe. And this picture is showing a control, which are these pots on the left, which are growing wheat in a sandy soil. The soil is literally sand. It's from the Cape Flats community outside Cape Town, which is an informal settlement where there's very poor people trying to grow a bit of food in the sand outside their house. And it's not very good at growing plants, you can see from this plant growth here. The next set I want you to look at are the third along, and this is where we've added the iron oxide that we talked about. So you'll see that these are actually darker green. That's because the iron oxide had some nitrogen in it that the sandy soil doesn't, but they're stunted. And when we look at the next side, we'll see that the biomass is not better, not statistically better. That means the weight of the plants in the ones that have had iron oxide added. When we add compost, the compost in South Africa is not very good, the stuff that we bought, but it is sold for money and people use it to increase the water holding capacity of their soil. But it's certainly not very good for growing the wheat here, you can see. So it has a negative effect. So the take-home message from this is that in comparison to the sandy soil, when you add the iron oxide, you get less plants. And when you add the compost, you get less plants. But this final one is when we add them both together. And please note that the amount we're adding is huge amounts. We wouldn't add this amount to a real soil, but in scientific experiments, we often take it to the extremes in order to see an effect in a short time scale, whereas it would take a longer time scale in the field. So when we look at the graph on the next page, you'll see that this co-amendment of minerals and carbon is best for the soil. So take a while to get your eye into this graph. It's a bit busy, but this is plant growth, i.e. the wheat, in the rebuilt sandy soils. So what we have on the y-axis is the mass in grams of, and this is once the plant's been dried out, the dry biomass for each of the different amendments. So we've got the control here in white, the error bars represent the standard deviation. And we've got, when we add more WTR, which is the iron oxide, it stands for water treatment residual, you can see a decrease in the biomass, which is statistically significant. That's what this little a means when we get to the 12.5 and 5%. Again, for the compost, these gray middle bars, when we add a little bit of compost, there's no different to the control, but when we add a lot of compost, it's pretty bad for the plants. They don't grow very much. But look at this synergistic, symbiotic effect. When we add the organic matter and the minerals, we see an increase in biomass, which is statistically significant at the 25% addition level. This is what's exciting. And when we published this paper in 2019, we didn't know about the very exciting work about the microbiome constructing the soil structure. And literally, the microbiome will take the inputs of carbon and other macronutrients and micronutrients and construct the right environment for it to live. So it needs bits of clay, it needs bits of silt, and it needs bits of sand, preferably, in order to create the right levels of oxic environments and anoxic environments, as well as the necessary macro and micronutrients. So finishing off, I only have a couple of slides now. By 2030, John Beddington, who's a former chief scientific advisor, has predicted, and many other people have as well, we need 50% more food across the world. We need 50% more energy. We need 30% more fresh water. And of course, we need to reach net zero. All of these are either directly or indirectly dependent on the soil. So let's think about the future. We did a survey a couple of years ago now of 3,661 school children, happened to be in 3 African countries. I don't think it would have made any difference if we'd done it in 3 European countries. We were wanting to know about their attitudes and behavior and the culture and comprehension of soil. What do they think about soil? How do they feel about it? Over half of them didn't understand the link between increased climate change and soil erosion. and hardly any of them thought soil was living. This is not surprising, and don't feel guilty if you didn't know these things either. The problem is we're not teaching people this, and it's absolutely urgent that we do. So the solution, in my opinion, is education, education, education. And to split it into 3 bullet points, we have to teach the kids, but we have to engage and inspire the kids to get their hands dirty and reconnect with the land. We have to teach the engineers. We are the ones who transform the natural environment into the built environment, and we're not teaching them about soil organic carbon and soil health and how we can transform natural environments into built environments and try to protect those ecosystem services that we're so dependent on at the moment. We must also teach all of our students, whatever subject they're looking at, the interdisciplinary skills needed to address the global challenges represented by the SDGs. I'm going to leave you with this image, and this is an image that I'm sure all of you have seen before. And a picture paints 1,000 words. When I saw this image, I'm sure you were the same. I thought, I use those earbuds. I'm going to stop using those earbuds. I shouldn't be using them anyway. But I now, if I do use them, have the ones made of cardboard. I don't have the plastic ones. And this image was taken by Justin Hoffman, who won Wildlife Photographer of the Year in 2017. And we need an image like this for soil. So this is a bit of a shout out that I'm going to end it with before I say thank you to all the partners that I've worked with, is if we had an image like this for soil that started the global movement interested in plastics, reducing our plastic usage, phasing out single-use plastics, then we would be some way forward. We haven't got it yet. So I'll just end by saying thank you so much again for inviting me. Thanks to all the people that I've talked to about a nation that rebuilds its soil. We're writing an academic paper at the minute that I can share with you once it's published. And it's meant to be quite friendly. And those partners are from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, from Australia, from the US, all around the world. So I'll stop sharing and stop talking.
Karen, that is absolutely fascinating, and the questions have been coming in, and right at the start you talked very much about soil being alive, and then about insecticides and pesticides killing the soil. And the first question that came in was indeed this: what are the alternatives?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and regenerative farming is the alternative, but there is no sturdy definition for regenerative farming, and for that reason, because speaking to farmers are as keen as you know, many people are, to move away from intensive conventional agriculture. There's big players now, Nestle and Bayer, who are looking and saying they're going to go regenerative, and McDonald's, I think, are talking about going regenerative for their beef. But regenerative we still need to use glyphosate, the herbicide, unfortunately, in the short term, because the economic models to make regenerative are not in place yet. Governments are going to have to invest, because to build up soil health to the extent where we believe that with diverse cropping and healthy soil carbon levels, we can produce food for people on a local level, then we're going to have governments funding that transitional period, because that's going to take time for that soil structure to rebuild, because we've degraded it so long. So I don't have the answers, but definitely the answer is that we don't have all the answers yet, but we will have to use those things in the transition. It's not like switching them off, and farmers would, you know, echo that.
And the follow-up questions come in: where does organic farming fit into these potential new policies?
Yeah, so organic farming is very exciting. Of course, we've known about it for a long time, and they've been in the background saying, please, let's move to more regenerative practices for a long time. I would say, I hope I'm not offending anybody by saying that the farmers I've spoken to prefer the term regenerative farming as opposed to organic or agroecological practices, because those ones are more hardline, saying you can't use any chemicals, and we're not going to certify you if you've used any chemicals in the last 2 years. And I can see that idealism, But when I understand about the economics and the persuading people to change, I think that many farmers are keener on the term regenerative rather than organic. But there's space for everyone, of course. And the organic farmers have led the way in many ways for decades, saying, look at us, this is how we should be doing it. And now we're finally looking at them and going, okay, we need to learn from this.
We've got a questioner that's come from a gardener who has been trying rock dust and was interested in what you said about the mix of compost and minerals.
Yes, I know that there's a company in Scotland which is really exciting about using rock dust as a fertilizer. And that's exactly what we should be doing, is looking for more sustainable methods of getting those macronutrients. You know, sometimes it's calcium that's missing, you know, particularly in some of the sandy soils in Africa, which are very unfertile because they don't have any clay. So yes, rock dust is great. Adding it with organic matter, where we understand that the benefits of doing that are that image I showed you of the transmission electron micrographs, is that we've got this attraction of minerals often to organic matter. You don't get many minerals that aren't coated with organic matter, particularly clay minerals, which some of the rock dust are more basaltic. That's exciting for adding sources of potassium and calcium. But when we're looking at more micronutrients, then it's the clays that tend to contain them. So we've got to look at either pedogenic, which means coming from the soil, sources of clay, or industrial sources of clay. And the clean drinking water treatment waste that I mentioned is one potential waste that we can use in conjunction with organic matter to get that right mix of carbon and mineral.
Now, a question's come in about soil rotation, pointing out that in the old days, well, maybe in a century ago or maybe more, soil rotation was at the time a great discovery, and then gradually it faded away to monoculture when people simply pushed the soil to produce annually. Do you think soil rotation is a concept that could come back?
Definitely. And, you know, this is why I reiterate, this is not rocket science. This is going back to the old knowledge, you know, the four-field rotation and, you know, that sort of idea. The only thing I would say about that is I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that you wouldn't leave a field fallow because of soil erosion, particularly in the environment that we're in with extreme weather events at the moment. But yes, rotation and getting a diverse range of crops is a fantastic idea, and this is knowledge that has been there, but we've not listened to it, you know, and we've educated farmers with intensive in agricultural practices at university, and so they're only putting into practice what they've been taught. We've taught them incorrectly as a society, you know, and we need to change that education.
One interesting question has come in about government schemes for agricultural support. After the last war, farmers were encouraged to break out land and encouraged to produce and to maximize production. And then we had the single farm payment, when basically farmers were just paid as it were to support them generally. There is obviously now a new system of agricultural support being prepared. What do you think some of the priorities for that new system ought to be?
I think that the new environmental land management scheme that is being looked at in conjunction with the agricultural bill is very exciting. What we want to reward farmers for is not just producing food, you know, because farmers, we know through the pandemic, are our heroes. You know, they're producing the food that we're eating. But we need to reward farmers to look after the soil as well, and they need to be financially rewarded to do that. So any package needs to do that. And that's what the environmental land management system is looking at. The stumbling block comes, and I alluded to it with my jokey slide on soil health, is the underpants is a great way to measure soil health, but it's obviously not very immediate and not terribly robust either. We are struggling, because soil health is so complex, to come up with a straightforward system for baselining what the soil health of the soil is. And that's a stumbling block. But any system put in place will start to reward farmers for those ecosystem services that soil offers. Because to be honest, you know, we might reach a stage in the future where we are growing soil, in some cases, growing food without soil. We're already starting to see booming industries in that area, and, you know, they will be looking to be as sustainable as possible, because all new businesses are, if they're to succeed. But we'll always need soil. We'll always need soil as a reservoir of antibiotics. We'll always need soil to hold on to our water and prevent the catastrophic events that we're seeing. We'll always need strong, resilient soils for our ecosystems. So that we have to reward those ecosystem services that farmers provide as well.
And in terms of direct ways of rewarding them, well, one example was in conservation of wild plants, for instance. And I remember there was a scheme that farmers were paid in proportion. So if they had more of a particular species of wild plant, they got paid more. Could there be some way then whereby one might measure each year, take samples each year of the quality of their soil and reward people who improved that?
Yes, I think that we are going to move towards, obviously we need to collect evidence. If there's money being given out, you need the evidence that people are doing the right thing. But the consensus amongst me and the partners that I'm working with on the framework for a nation that rebuilds its soil is that we can't wait until we've got that mechanism in place. We need to facilitate farmers by changing, well, this is going to take time as well, of course, changing policy so that we can add the minerals to the soil, because we've got to start rebuilding soils. We can't wait, basically. So yes, we can look at different measurements, and the wild plants, you know, those plants, indigenous plants, full stop, which is why I'm excited about the talk in a couple of days about wealth of weeds. Indigenous plants, weeds are not weeds. They're what is meant to grow in our soils, and they're delivering to the microbiome. So we've got to learn to work in harmony with them. But then, you know, a farmer will tell you, well, I can't, you know, some are invasive and some are going to take over. We need to also have that balance of being able to remove the ones that are stopping us get the crops that we want to eat. So it's a balance, and we need to develop a range of techniques to measure soil health.
Now, it's interesting that we speak about farmers because, of course, how much land is in agriculture. But I guess that the amount of land in gardens must be quite considerable. And I can think of lots of gardeners who go to the gardening centres and stock up with pesticides and weed killers to eradicate every dandelion and daisy off their lawn so that they can make it a beautiful, smooth, green one. To what extent can gardeners be re-educated or encouraged to welcome some of the so-called weeds into their garden as a source of nutrition as well as improving the soil?
I think there's a huge opportunity there for us, and that's where the sort of culture aspect comes into it. I remember being chucked off my allotment about 7-8 years ago, and I was never great at my allotment. I got 3 kids and I was struggling. But one of the reasons why I was chucked off was because we just had massive floods. Actually, it was 2012. It was a supercell storm event in Newcastle. And I needed to get down and sort out my allotment, and I hadn't been down there. Eventually, when I went down, the woman who was in charge, she was very nice, but she was like, it's full of weeds, you know. And of course, I'd been down before this meeting to sort it out, like any good allotment holder would do. And I deliberately left these plants because they were flowering and they were attracting the bees. I said, they're not weeds. They're, you know, cover crops. And I didn't really know the terms to use them. I didn't win the argument, probably rightly so, because I wasn't really pulling my weight on the allotment. But still, I think we need a change in culture about what is, and I think it's happening, you know, what is a weed? And if we take a more positive note on it, our gardens are actually some of the healthiest soils that we have, because although we might be using slug pellets and glyphosate and, you know, those sorts of chemicals that are not good for biodiversity, we often do add organic matter. Gardeners know soil very well. We don't necessarily add minerals, but we sometimes do add a bit of grit. And those things, you know, it's very difficult to completely kill soil. The good news is that the modelling that's been done by Rothamsted, which is the Soil Institute in the UK, the modelling that's been done shows that if you kill soil by adding too much chemical fertiliser and pesticides and herbicides, you don't completely kill it. All of the microbiome is still there. Everything is everywhere, but the environment selects, is the saying. So if you change the environment and start adding in more diverse sources of carbon from plants, and you use less pesticide and less herbicide and a lot less chemical fertilizer, then the soil can recover. And we think it can take anywhere, to get back to full health up to 5 years. We think we can rebuild soils from scratch in 5 to 20 years. We've got evidence of that from the literature, and that's what our agenda is about. It's not all or nothing. It's just use a bit less, and so the gardens are quite healthy because we have been having inputs, even though we've been adding stuff that kills stuff, that the microbiome's been able to hold on in many cases.
So in terms of climate change and the question that comes up, well, increasingly each week as we move to the big conference in Glasgow later in the year, the question is what each individual can do. Would you say then that every individual who has a garden can make a difference?
I think so, by allowing some of those weeds to, if we're lucky enough to have a garden, don't be so harsh on the weeds, don't pull them all out. Certainly don't leave any bare soil. I mean, the cats are going to come, aren't they, if you have the bare soil anyway. So I think that having cover crops, whether those be weeds or whatever, is a good thing. And of course, a range of flowers for the bees and the biodiversity, above ground biodiversity is good. What we know now is that this is all a connected system, and the more diversity we have, the better, and the better for the soil and the better for us and our health.
And one final question from a listener in Edinburgh who asks about peatlands. We've been speaking about farmland, cultivated soil and so on. And she asks, what about the role of peatland? Why is it so important for climate? And is it therefore more important than ever to protect peatland?
Absolutely. And I didn't talk about that at all, because the guidance for peatland is very clear. We shouldn't be burning it. We shouldn't be draining it. We should be keeping it waterlogged, because that's basically what stops the carbon from being used as a food source. Just like we would eat a sandwich and we need oxygen in order to break that sandwich down into energy and the materials we use to rebuild our bodies. Soil is the same. And so if we remove the oxygen by having waterlogging, then that's where the organic matter builds up. And so the policy guidance is very clear for peatlands now. We don't really need to do anything other than to start protecting it more.
This has been a fascinating talk. So many farmers and gardeners and people interested in all aspects of soil and environment and climate will have had a great deal to think about and appreciate. Thank you indeed, Karen, for a fascinating talk. And thank you for everyone who participated. And thank you to our technical team behind the scenes, that's Swain, Martin, Rainer, Mick and Stuart. Our next talk today will be at 1 o'clock when we'll meet two of the team who are planning to row the Northwest Passage next year between Canada's Atlantic and Pacific shores. All our events this year are free, but if you enjoyed the event and want to show your appreciation, you can send us a donation via PayPal. The link is in the YouTube description below. Or if you're watching this on the festival website, it's in the right-hand column of the page. We're posting updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we welcome likes and shares there as well. But in the meantime, thank you again to our speaker, and thank you wherever you are for joining in, and goodbye.